Serena woke up to a quiet, normal morning. The kind of day that felt routine, as though the universe was offering a break from the chaos of the week. The sun filtered through her curtains, casting a soft glow across her room as she rubbed her eyes and stretched, preparing herself for another business trip. As usual, she was the first one awake, the early riser who thrived in the solitude of the morning. Her bags were already packed, neatly organized for the trip ahead. A flight to New York for a conference. It wasn't glamorous, but it was part of her job as a senior executive, a role she had earned through hard work and sacrifice. She moved through her apartment with ease, brewing coffee and running through her mental checklist. She double-checked the weather app, picked up her keys, and locked the door behind her. Her black leather suitcase rolled smoothly behind her as she walked through the familiar streets to the subway station. The hum of the city felt comforting, the rhythm of the morning commute was one she knew well. Crowds of people walked past her, all in their own worlds, focused on their own destinations. Serena blended in, just another face in the sea of commuters. At the airport, the process was almost mechanical. She checked in, got her boarding pass, and breezed through security. It was all so familiar to her, this routine that she had perfected over the years. But even on days that seemed ordinary, there was an undercurrent of unease. Serena was well aware of the challenges she faced as a black woman in a professional world where she was often one of the few people who looked like her. Despite her success, there were always whispers, sideways glances, and moments when she felt like she had to prove herself more than her colleagues. It was the subtle kind of racism that most people didn't see or didn't want to admit existed. The microaggressions, the assumptions, the underestimation, it all weighed on her, but she had learned to carry it with grace. As she approached the gate, Serena felt a sense of relief. She had a few minutes to relax before boarding. She reached into her purse for her phone, scanning through emails and checking the news. The flight had been delayed a bit, but nothing too dramatic. She noticed a couple of airport officers standing near the gate, conversing in low tones. One of them, a tall, stocky man with a crew cut, seemed to keep glancing in her direction. Serena shrugged it off, assuming he was just scanning the crowd. But there was something about the way he kept looking at her that felt different. Her thoughts were interrupted when a voice called out, "Excuse me, ma'am." Serena turned to see the officer who had been eyeing her walking towards her, his expression unreadable. "Can I see your ID and boarding pass, please?" "Of course," Serena replied, a polite smile on her face as she handed over the documents. She had been through this process hundreds of times before, she didn't think twice about it. But as the officer took the documents, something shifted in the air. There was an uncomfortable tension, like something was about to go wrong. The officer scanned the boarding pass, then glanced at Serena, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is there a problem?" Serena asked, her smile faltering. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to his partner, a younger woman with short, curly hair who had been standing off to the side, watching the exchange. Serena's instincts told her that something was off. The woman stepped forward now, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "We just need to confirm some details," the woman said, taking the boarding pass from the first officer's hand. "It's just a precautionary measure. Please stand here." Serena's heart rate picked up slightly. She was used to security checks, but this felt different. There was a strange coldness in their demeanor, something that made her feel less like a passenger and more like a suspect. She glanced around, noticing that a few nearby passengers were beginning to watch the exchange. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. Serena had always been the type to remain composed, to hold her ground, but in this moment, she felt something shift inside her. The familiar confidence she usually exuded felt fragile, like it could break apart with one wrong move. "Ma'am, please remain where you are," the officer repeated, his voice firm but not unkind. He stepped closer, scanning her from head to toe. Serena stood still, her mind racing. She had a sinking feeling that she knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't about her ticket. It wasn't about any mistake or mix-up. This was about something far more insidious. She had experienced this before, being watched more closely than others, being questioned more thoroughly, treated like she didn't belong. It was something she had learned to tolerate in her day-to-day life, but it always stung. Especially when she knew it had nothing to do with her actions, but everything to do with the color of her skin. "I don't understand," Serena said, her voice calm but firm. "I've flown hundreds of times. You can check my record if you need to. My ticket is valid." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he exchanged another glance with his partner, who seemed to be processing something on her handheld device. The seconds dragged on, stretching longer and longer, and the silence between them became unbearable. Serena felt her blood pressure rise, a sense of injustice creeping into her thoughts. She had flown on military planes, had served her country with honor, had faced challenges far greater than this, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Her stomach churned with frustration, and her jaw clenched tightly. "You're going to have to step aside for further questioning," the officer finally said, his tone not asking, but commanding. His words felt like a slap to her chest, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she could keep herself composed. But she knew she had to. She couldn't let them see how much this was affecting her. "Why?" she asked, a bit sharper now. "What is the reason for this?" "I'm just trying to board my flight." "We're just following standard protocol," the officer replied, but there was an edge to his voice that made her doubt the truth of his words. His partner was already speaking into a radio, presumably calling in for more help. Serena looked around, her heart racing. The passengers who had been watching her were now looking away, as if embarrassed by the scene. Some of them were avoiding eye contact altogether, others were pretending not to notice. No one stepped forward to intervene, and that made her feel even more isolated. "You can't be serious," Serena said, her voice trembling slightly now. She was doing everything she could to stay calm, but the sense of injustice was overwhelming. This wasn't just about a flight. This wasn't just about paperwork. This was about something deeper, something far more insidious that had been embedded in the fabric of society for centuries. "You're causing a disturbance," the officer said suddenly, as if the words were meant to deflect blame onto her. "We're just doing our jobs. You need to calm down." "I am calm," Serena replied, her voice low but firm. "But I'm not going to let you treat me like this without asking questions." A few more minutes passed, and Serena could feel her patience wearing thin. She had seen enough of this behavior in her life to recognize when it was happening. This wasn't an innocent mistake. She knew what was going on, even if the officers didn't admit it outright. The racial profiling, the assumption that she didn't belong, the way they treated her as if she was a threat, Serena had lived through it before, and she wasn't about to let it slide now. And that was when she made a decision, one that would change everything. As Serena stood at the gate, her thoughts swirled. Her emotions were a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and disbelief, but she held them in check, not wanting to let her composure crack. The officer's words rang in her ears, but the longer she stood there, the more she realized this wasn't about a simple misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something more sinister. Her pulse raced as the minutes ticked by. She had been through enough difficult situations to recognize when something wasn't right, and the way these officers were treating her, with such quiet hostility, confirmed it. Serena's mind whirred, calculating her next move. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, some avoiding eye contact, others clearly uncomfortable, but not one person had stepped forward to intervene. In her entire life, Serena had always been taught to stand up for what was right, but in moments like these, it was hard to know what that meant. She glanced at her watch. Only a few minutes had passed since the officer's demand for her to step aside. The gate was still crowded with passengers, some eagerly waiting for the announcement to board, others fiddling with their phones or chatting in small groups. No one seemed to notice her, and that realization stung more than she cared to admit. A few whispered words reached her ears. Why is she being singled out? She doesn't look like trouble. The implication was clear. Serena's heart clenched. She knew exactly what they were implying, even if no one dared to say it aloud. The younger officer, the one with the curly hair, now stood next to her, her arms crossed, watching Serena with a quiet intensity. The silence between them was oppressive, and Serena could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, like she was being sized up, judged. It made her skin crawl. Why was she being treated like this? Why was she being held here, questioned, for simply doing what every other passenger was doing? The older officer, the one who had first approached her, stood off to the side, tapping something into a small device in his hand. Serena could feel her frustration mounting. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to lash out. But she knew that would only make the situation worse. Instead, she folded her arms, clenching her fists to keep herself from trembling. She had to remain in control, had to show them that she was more than the assumptions they were making about her. This wasn't just about the flight. This was about something much bigger, something that had plagued her for years. It was the systemic inequality she faced every day of her life. The prejudice she had encountered in meetings, the raised eyebrows when she spoke confidently in boardrooms, the sneers she'd learned to ignore in the streets. A few more minutes passed. Serena felt the tension between her and the officers growing thicker, the air growing hotter with each second. Then, something unexpected happened. The supervisor arrived. She was a tall woman in a crisp uniform, her expression unreadable, but there was a definite edge to her step as she approached. She spoke to the officers in a low voice, and Serena couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but it was clear the officers were being reprimanded in some way. The supervisor turned to Serena, her eyes briefly scanning her before she nodded curtly. "Ma'am," she said, her voice neutral. "We're going to have to ask you to step aside for further questioning. Please follow me." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the scene that had unfolded in front of other passengers. It was as if Serena had become a problem that needed to be dealt with swiftly, without much concern for the emotional toll it was taking on her. Serena hesitated, a sudden rush of anger flooding through her. The idea of being treated like a criminal, like someone who didn't belong, gnawed at her. She had every right to board this flight. She had every right to exist in this space without being questioned. But the more she thought about it, the more she understood. This wasn't just about her. This was about a system that had always treated people like her as if they were suspicious, as if their very existence was an inconvenience. And now, standing here, with the eyes of a dozen strangers on her, Serena had to make a choice. Would she comply with the request and play by the rules, or would she challenge the unfairness of it all? Her mind raced. She had spent years learning how to navigate the world as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated industry. She had learned to smile through uncomfortable situations, to stand tall in the face of discrimination, to fight for the space she deserved. But in moments like this, when the rules didn't make sense and the systems were clearly stacked against her, she wasn't sure how to fight. "I'm not going anywhere," Serena finally said, her voice trembling but resolute. The words hung in the air like a challenge, not just to the officers, but to everyone who had ever tried to make her feel less than. "I have a right to board this flight. And if you want to stop me, you'll have to explain why." The officer with the crew cut looked at her, his eyes flickering with annoyance. "Ma'am, I'm just following protocol," he said, his voice clipped, as if trying to maintain control over the situation. But Serena could see through the facade. This wasn't about protocol. This was about something deeper, something that ran far beyond the walls of the airport. The younger officer stepped forward, her eyes now hard. "You're making a scene. This is unnecessary. Just cooperate, and we can resolve this." "I am cooperating," Serena shot back, her voice cutting through the air. What exactly do you think I've done that warrants this treatment? The supervisor, who had been standing silently to the side, finally spoke again, her voice sharper than before. You're holding up the line. The rest of the passengers are waiting. Let's move this along. Serena's fists clenched tighter, but she didn't back down. The power dynamic between her and the officers was undeniable. They had the authority. They had the uniforms. They had the support of the system. But Serena had something they didn't, her dignity. She wasn't going to let them take that from her, no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone else. A few more passengers had begun to notice what was happening now, murmuring amongst themselves. Serena could feel their eyes on her. Some were sympathetic, others were uncomfortable. But none of them intervened. No one said a word. It felt as if they were all complicit, complicit in her humiliation, complicit in the injustice that was unfolding before them. She had always believed in the goodness of people, in their ability to rise to the occasion when things went wrong. But in this moment, Serena realized that people would rarely step up unless they were directly impacted. It was always easier to look the other way. I'm not going to let you do this, Serena said quietly, but with a new, steely resolve in her voice. You have no reason to hold me here. I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else. The supervisor's expression softened ever so slightly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she motioned for the officers to follow her down the hallway, away from the gate area. Serena stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling a strange sense of pride mixed with bitterness. As she watched them walk away, she made a silent vow to herself. She wasn't going to let this go. She would fight for what was right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it would be. But as she turned to walk in the opposite direction, towards the gate, a strange calm washed over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her past experiences come to the surface. She had spent so many years battling microaggressions, fighting to prove herself, trying to be better than what others expected of her. But this was different. This wasn't about being better than anyone else. It was about demanding respect. She had earned that. Serena watched the officers retreat down the hallway, her mind still racing. She had expected some sort of resolution, perhaps a swift apology or even an explanation that would offer some sense of clarity. But nothing happened. The moments stretched out as she stood there, rooted in place, feeling like time itself had conspired to put her in this moment. The humiliation still stung, but the anger had started to fade, replaced by a cool, resolute determination. Serena wasn't the type to back down, not from a challenge, not from something that was fundamentally wrong. And this felt wrong. She knew it was. She walked slowly toward the gate, her gaze meeting the eyes of the other passengers. Some of them were still staring, their faces filled with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Serena had never been the type to demand attention, but right now, she could feel the weight of their eyes on her, some of them silent witnesses to an injustice they were too afraid to address. The others? They had already turned away, pretending not to notice or simply too consumed by their own lives to care. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Serena wasn't going to let this go. Her footsteps echoed through the terminal as she moved toward the gate, her suitcase rolling smoothly behind her. As she neared the counter, the clerk gave her a quick glance, but Serena wasn't in the mood for small talk. She had dealt with too much already. With a quiet but firm voice, Serena asked, "Is my flight boarding yet?" The clerk, a young woman with bright eyes and a hesitant smile, nodded and gestured to the screen behind her. "Your flight's been delayed by about 20 minutes, but you're free to wait." Serena offered a polite smile in return, but her mind was elsewhere. Her eyes lingered on the screen as she calculated the time. The clock was ticking, and the frustration she felt about what had just happened lingered like an unwelcome shadow. She had been through too many moments in her life that had tested her resolve, and today was just another one in a long line of experiences that demanded she stand tall, demanding respect, refusing to be silenced. She had fought for this career. She had sacrificed so much to get to this point. And now, she would not let anyone take it from her. As she stood there, waiting for the announcement to board, Serena began to replay the entire interaction in her mind. The way the officers had spoken to her, the way they had acted like she was the one causing trouble. It wasn't just the way they treated her. It was how they made her feel, invisible, less than, as if she didn't belong in this space, as if her presence was somehow an inconvenience to them. Serena knew, deep down, that the problem wasn't her. It wasn't her actions or her behavior, it was the way society had conditioned people to look at her, to see her as a threat, as something to be feared simply because of her skin color. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden rush of passengers heading toward the gate as the announcement was made that boarding would begin. Serena grabbed her suitcase and moved forward, her movements swift and determined. She wasn't going to let the past few minutes define her. She wasn't going to let those officers have the power to take her dignity, not anymore. As she made her way to the front of the line, she noticed the officers returning, now with their supervisor in tow. The supervisor's eyes flickered over Serena, but there was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. They all stood there, as if waiting for Serena to make the next move. Serena's heart raced as she approached the counter. But instead of glancing at the officers, she kept her eyes fixed on the gate agent, who seemed to be giving her a slightly confused look. She wasn't sure what the agent had seen or what she knew, but Serena didn't care anymore. She had made her decision. If she was going to be treated like this, she was going to make sure people knew about it. "I'm sorry," the gate agent said in a soft voice as she typed something into her computer. "There seems to be a discrepancy with your boarding pass. It's saying you're not allowed to board yet." Serena's mind immediately clicked into overdrive. Another delay? Another excuse? She couldn't take it anymore. Her patience had worn thin, and now there was nothing left but pure frustration. She could feel her hands tremble slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm, to stay composed. She couldn't let them win. "I've been through enough today," Serena said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "I've already been delayed. And I've been treated unfairly. So if there's something wrong with my boarding pass, I expect an explanation." The gate agent hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously between Serena and the officers standing a few feet behind her. She could tell there was a power struggle in the air, but she didn't know what to do. Serena didn't give her a chance to backtrack. "I'll take the next available flight, or a refund. But I'm not going to stand here and be treated like I'm a criminal. I'm done with this." For a moment, there was silence. The officers shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, unsure of how to proceed. Serena could see the tension building. The supervisor stepped forward, her voice clipped as she addressed the gate agent. "Make sure everything is in order. We're going to take care of this." But Serena wasn't listening anymore. She had already made up her mind. The silence that followed was filled with tension as the minutes passed. The air in the terminal felt thick, like a storm was brewing. The officers stood to one side, their faces unreadable, but Serena knew they were watching her. And for the first time that day, she didn't care. She had been forced into a situation that no one should ever have to face. She had been humiliated, questioned, and scrutinized in a way that no one else would have been. But she wasn't going to let it define her. She wasn't going to allow it to break her. She had worked too hard for everything she had achieved, and she had fought too long for her place in this world. Finally, the gate agent turned back to Serena, her face pale. "It's all cleared up. You're good to board," she said quietly, almost apologetically. Serena gave her a nod, though the words felt hollow. It wasn't just about getting on the plane anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that needed to be acknowledged, something that demanded change. As Serena walked down the jet bridge, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. The confrontation wasn't over, it was just beginning. She knew there was a lot more work to be done. But for the first time that day, she felt something else too, a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without doing something. She wasn't going to be just another woman who let it slide, who stayed quiet, who let the system run over her. Serena knew that if she didn't speak up, if she didn't take action, nothing would ever change. She boarded the plane and found her seat, her heart still pounding in her chest, but her resolve stronger than ever. The wheels of the plane began to turn, and as the aircraft slowly started to taxi toward the runway, Serena took a deep breath. She was leaving behind the scene at the gate, but she knew that what had happened was far from over. She had a story to tell, and she wasn't going to let it fade away in the background. Not when it could change everything. As the plane ascended into the sky, Serena pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the city below shrink into a distant memory. Her mind swirled, the events of the last few hours replaying in her mind like a film on repeat. The discomfort she had felt at the airport hadn't fully dissipated, but something had changed within her. The sting of the officer's treatment was still fresh, but there was a new sense of clarity taking root inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced before, not this deeply, not this profoundly. She had always known the world was full of inequalities, of subtle and overt prejudices. She had spent her life navigating them, adjusting, adapting, finding ways to succeed despite them. But what had happened today wasn't just about Serena. It wasn't just about one woman's battle for respect, it was a representation of something much bigger. It was about every black person, every woman, every individual who had been forced to fight for a place in a system that was not designed for them. She thought about the people she had left behind at the airport, the passengers who had silently witnessed the altercation, some uncomfortable, others indifferent, none of them willing to speak out. That silence had echoed in her mind since the moment it happened, and it had gnawed at her ever since. In that moment, she had felt the weight of an entire history of injustice. She had felt the cruelty of being silenced, the weight of being invisible, even as her presence was the one that had been questioned. It was a dehumanizing experience, and one that Serena had encountered before in different forms. But now, as she sat on the plane, her pulse slowing and her thoughts clearing, she realized that this wasn't just about personal suffering, it was about collective action. It was about using her voice for something bigger than herself, something that could resonate and change the way things were. The more Serena thought about it, the clearer it became that what had happened at the gate wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that spanned beyond airports and into schools, workplaces, homes, and streets across the country. It was systemic, ingrained, and nearly invisible to those who weren't directly affected. But she knew better than anyone that the problem wasn't her reaction, it was the treatment itself. And if she didn't do something about it, if she didn't speak up and challenge it, then the cycle would continue. She had never been one to stay silent, but now more than ever, she realized that silence was complicity. She thought about the people who had stood by, witnessing it all unfold. What had stopped them from intervening? From stepping forward and speaking out? Was it fear? Indifference? The assumption that this was just the way things were? Serena didn't know. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just the officers who had failed her, it was everyone who hadn't said a word, who hadn't stepped in. The realization hit her hard. This was a systemic issue that went far beyond the actions of two officers. It was about the culture of compliance, of looking the other way when something wasn't right. And that, she realized, was the biggest injustice of all. As the plane flew higher, Serena leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The flight was long, and she needed time to process everything that had happened. She had been so focused on the incident itself that she hadn't given herself the time or space to reflect on what it meant, both for her and for the people around her. She knew that if she didn't take action soon, if she didn't use this moment to make a change, it would eat at her. She wasn't sure what that action would look like yet, but she knew she couldn't go back to the silence of before. She had to speak up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or made to feel less than. The plane was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engines, and Serena found herself lost in thought. Her mind turned back to the woman who had stood by the gate, the one who had told her that everything was cleared up. The supervisor who had done nothing to correct the officer's behavior. She had simply moved the situation along without acknowledging the injustice that had unfolded. Serena had expected more from her. But maybe that was the point. The people in power often didn't see the problem unless it was right in front of them. It wasn't enough to simply move past the uncomfortable moments. It wasn't enough to quietly clear things up. It was time for change, time for people in positions of authority to recognize their role in perpetuating systemic issues, even if it was just by standing by in silence. The more Serena thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't let this be swept under the rug. She had to do something. But what? She was a woman of action, and she couldn't just wait around for someone else to fix this. No, she had to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't change the world overnight, but she could change her own path, and perhaps, in the process, inspire others to do the same. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. Serena spent the next few hours in a kind of reflective haze, drifting in and out of thoughts about her past, her experiences, and what the future might hold. She thought about her childhood, growing up in a neighborhood where everyone looked like her, where they understood the struggles, the nuances of living as a black woman in a predominantly white world. But when she left for college, when she entered the workforce, things began to shift. The moments of discomfort began to multiply. She learned how to fight back, to push through the small cuts and bruises of discrimination, to be the best version of herself. But every now and then, she would face something like what had happened today, something that made her feel like no matter how hard she tried, no matter how successful she became, she would always be seen as other. Her thoughts were interrupted by the flight attendant walking down the aisle, offering drinks. Serena took a moment to shake off the heaviness of her thoughts. She had a decision to make. What would she do once she landed? She could go back to her quiet, successful life, shrug off what had happened as just another unpleasant experience, another story to tell at a dinner party. Or, she could use this as the catalyst for something bigger, something that reached beyond her. Something that could help those who didn't have the same platform, the same voice. Serena was no stranger to adversity. She had faced countless challenges throughout her career and life, from microaggressions in the workplace to blatant racism that tried to stop her progress. She had been forced to fight every step of the way. But as she sat there, staring out at the clouds, she realized that this wasn't just a battle for herself, it was a battle for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. She wasn't just going to let this go. She couldn't. She had a duty, not just to herself, but to others who didn't have the luxury of fighting back. They needed someone to stand up for them, to show that it was possible to take on the system and win. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't enough to just react. She had to be proactive. She had to use this moment, this experience, to fuel something bigger. Serena knew she couldn't let this story fade into the background. She had to share it, to speak out, to demand change. But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy. She would face resistance. People would tell her to let it go, to stop making waves. But Serena wasn't going to be silenced anymore. The silence that had surrounded her for so long would no longer be her prison. As the plane began its descent, Serena's heart began to beat faster, a sense of purpose growing within her. This was just the beginning. The story wasn't over. It was only just starting. And Serena was ready to take on the next chapter, whatever it might bring. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to stay quiet. She was going to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been pushed to the margins, who had been treated like they didn't matter. This was her moment to make a change, and she was going to make sure it counted. The plane finally touched down, and the jolt of landing seemed to bring Serena back to the present. Her fingers clutched the armrest as the wheels screeched against the tarmac, signaling that she had arrived, but the journey inside her mind was far from over. The lights of the airport terminal gleamed through the windows, casting long, yellow shadows on the floor. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, Serena took a deep breath, releasing the tension in her shoulders. She had been so caught up in her thoughts, in what had happened hours ago, that she almost forgot the world outside the plane still existed, still carried on as if everything was normal. She gathered her things and filed off the plane along with the other passengers, moving quickly through the gate. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of plans, ideas, and possibilities. She had made a decision, and now it was time to act. The confrontation at the airport wasn't something she could easily forget, but it was a moment she knew would fuel her purpose moving forward. She wasn't going to let it just slip away into the background of her life. Not after everything it represented, not after everything she'd been through to get here. Serena made her way through the terminal, her suitcase rolling beside her, her heart still thumping in her chest. The busy airport hummed with the sounds of rushing people, the announcements blaring over the loudspeakers, and the smell of fresh coffee and fast food mingling in the air. It was a chaotic scene, but she had never felt so focused, so clear in her intention. She wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. Not after what had happened. She was determined to make a change, to ensure that her story didn't end with the incident at the gate. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was for anyone who had ever felt marginalized, misunderstood, or unjustly treated. She pulled out her phone and checked the time, knowing she had a few hours before her next meeting. She had already made plans to speak with an old colleague who had connections in the local media, someone who might help amplify her voice. It was time to turn her frustration into something actionable. She couldn't let this story remain a personal battle, it needed to become part of a larger conversation. She was going to make sure the world heard her, and more importantly, heard the truth. The airport was buzzing with activity, but Serena moved with a sense of urgency, as if she were walking through a space that no longer had the power to intimidate her. She'd faced so much adversity throughout her life, but now she could feel a different kind of fire within her, one that wasn't born out of desperation, but out of sheer will. She had been tested, she had been belittled, and she had been forced to navigate a system designed to keep her down. But this moment, this experience, had been the catalyst she needed. She realized how much she had internalized the belief that change would happen slowly, that it would take years or decades of incremental progress. But that moment at the gate, the way she had been treated, had cracked open something inside of her. It wasn't going to be enough for her to simply accept the way things were. She was done waiting for progress to trickle in. She was going to make it happen now. The minutes seemed to stretch as she made her way to the waiting area, but Serena didn't feel tired. In fact, she felt a surge of energy that propelled her forward. She found a seat in the lounge, unpacking her laptop and taking a sip from her water bottle. Her mind was racing, but now it was time to strategize. She could feel her phone vibrating, but she ignored it for the moment, focusing instead on her thoughts. It wasn't long before the messages started coming in, texts from her friends and colleagues. They had seen what had happened. The videos had started to circulate online, and word was spreading. At first, the messages were supportive, offering words of comfort and solidarity. But then, as the story began to gain traction, the tone shifted. People started asking her what happened, how they could help, what they could do to get involved. The more questions she received, the more she realized that this was bigger than just one woman, one incident. It was a moment that people needed to hear, and more importantly, a story that needed to be shared. Serena hadn't planned on becoming an advocate, but now, in this moment, it seemed like the only thing that made sense. She wasn't going to let her experience be buried in the noise of everyday life. She was going to make sure it resonated, that it changed the way people thought about their own actions and inactions. As the hours passed, Serena sat in the lounge, scrolling through her phone and replying to messages, her mind turning with ideas on how to best frame this experience. She had a platform, she had worked hard for that platform, fought for it every step of the way, but now she understood that it wasn't enough to simply use it for herself. She needed to amplify the voices of those who didn't have the same access, the same opportunities. Her story wasn't just a reflection of her own struggle, it was a reflection of something larger, something more systemic. The officers at the airport didn't see her as a person, they saw her as an obstacle, a problem. They had no idea who she was, what she had accomplished, or how hard she had worked to get to this point. They didn't see the years of sacrifice, the years of overcoming doubt, the years of pushing against a system that told her no at every turn. They saw only her skin. Serena's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, drafting her statement. It wasn't just about recounting what had happened at the airport. It was about the larger implications of that moment, about how it reflected the countless daily injustices faced by black people, especially black women, in a world that wasn't built for them. She wasn't just going to share her experience, she was going to demand change. She would speak out not only for herself, but for the people who didn't have the same access to a platform, for the ones whose stories were ignored and forgotten. By the time Serena finished her draft, she had a clear plan in mind. She wasn't going to stop with just one post or one video. She was going to take this to the media, she was going to demand accountability from the airport authorities, and she was going to make sure this story stayed alive. She wanted the officers to be held accountable, yes, but she also wanted to shift the culture, to make people stop and think about how their actions affected others. It wasn't enough to simply be sorry, people needed to understand the systemic issues that allowed this kind of treatment to happen in the first place. Serena knew it wasn't going to be easy. She knew there would be pushback. But she also knew that this was the moment. The world was watching, and she wasn't going to let the moment pass by without taking full advantage of it. As she hit send on the post, Serena felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The story was out there now, and it wasn't just her story, it was everyone's. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath, knowing that the work had just begun. She had made her decision, no more silence, no more accepting the status quo. If she could bring one person's experience to the forefront, if she could spark one conversation, then she would have made a difference. And that difference would start right now. As Serena's post went live, she felt the rush of vulnerability, mixed with the weight of determination. The world she had known for so long, the world of quiet professionalism and measured responses, was no longer the world she was willing to inhabit. Her heart raced, and she could feel the tension of anticipation hanging in the air around her. There was no turning back now. She had put herself out there, laid bare her experience for the world to see. There was a strange kind of power in that moment, an empowerment that came from the raw honesty of sharing something so personal, so painful, with the hope that it might ignite something bigger. Almost immediately, the responses began flooding in. At first, it was the expected wave of support from friends, colleagues, and family. Words of encouragement, expressions of solidarity, and messages of praise for her courage to speak up. But as the hours passed, Serena began to notice something different. More strangers had started to comment. Some were echoing her sentiments, sharing their own experiences with racial profiling and discrimination. Others were more critical, questioning her version of events, suggesting that she was overreacting, or implying that the situation had been blown out of proportion. Serena braced herself for the backlash. She knew it was coming, just as she knew that this conversation was going to push people to reflect on uncomfortable truths. She read the comments carefully, not to appease the doubters, but to understand the mindset of those who were questioning her. One comment stood out. It was long, articulate, and clearly written by someone who had considered the broader implications of what had happened. The person, a former law enforcement officer, offered a perspective that Serena hadn't anticipated. The commenter explained how systemic biases within law enforcement, while often unconscious, could lead to misjudgments and misunderstandings. They didn't deny that Serena had been wronged, but they pointed out that the behavior of the officers, though damaging, was likely a result of deeper cultural issues within the institution. Their comments suggested that the real problem lay not just in isolated incidents like Serena's, but in the broader systemic forces that shaped those who wore the uniform. This was not the kind of feedback Serena had expected to receive. It was thought-provoking and insightful, and it made her reflect on her approach. She realized that the conversation wasn't just about one individual's experience, it was about changing an entire system, about asking hard questions that would make people rethink their roles in perpetuating inequality. By the time she finished reading the comments, Serena felt a sense of clarity and purpose that she hadn't felt before. This was not just a fight for justice for her, it was a movement for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or erased. But she knew that the journey wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, and there would be people who tried to dismiss her story, who tried to make her feel like she didn't belong in the conversation. But Serena had already decided that she wasn't going to let those voices dictate her narrative. The truth was too powerful to be silenced. And she had already made a commitment to herself and to the people who had supported her, that she would continue to push for change, no matter how difficult it became. As the days passed, Serena found herself in the midst of a whirlwind. Her story spread faster than she could have ever imagined. News outlets picked it up, offering her the opportunity to share her experiences on television and in interviews. Each time she spoke, each time she recounted the moment at the airport, the anger and the frustration that had once been so overwhelming began to transform into something else. It was no longer just about the officer's treatment of her, it was about the thousands of other people who had suffered in silence, who had been subjected to the same indignities, day after day, without any recourse. She began to understand the true power of her voice, not as a woman who had been wronged, but as an advocate for a change that could shift the very way society saw race, gender, and power. One afternoon, as Serena sat in a local cafe, scrolling through the growing number of messages and news articles about her story, she received an unexpected call. It was from a community leader, someone who had been following her story closely. The leader was a longtime advocate for racial justice and had been involved in several high-profile cases where people of color had faced unjust treatment. They spoke to Serena about organizing a rally, a gathering to bring attention to the issues of racial profiling, discrimination, and the need for accountability within law enforcement. They wanted Serena to be a part of it, to share her story as the centerpiece of the event. It was an opportunity that Serena hadn't considered, but one that she knew could take her advocacy to the next level. It was a chance to turn her experience into something tangible, something that could galvanize a movement. She spent the next few days carefully considering the invitation. The idea of speaking in front of a crowd, of taking the next step in her journey toward change, was both exhilarating and terrifying. She knew that it wouldn't be easy. There would be critics, there would be people who disagreed with her message, and there would be others who would attempt to discredit her. But Serena knew that the only way forward was to confront these challenges head-on, to refuse to back down. She had seen firsthand how silence allowed injustices to persist. She had learned that silence, while often comfortable, was the enemy of progress. After much reflection, Serena agreed to participate in the rally. She began to work with the organizers, helping to plan the details of the event, ensuring that it would not only raise awareness but also spark real action. She spent hours researching, talking to other activists, and learning about the history of racial injustice in her community. The more she learned, the more driven she became. She was no longer just telling her story, she was connecting it to a larger narrative, one that spanned generations, that tied together the struggles of countless people who had fought for equality long before her. The day of the rally arrived, and Serena stood before a crowd of hundreds, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment was surreal. She had imagined this day many times, but now that it was here, it felt like the culmination of a journey that had started long before that moment at the airport. As she stepped up to the microphone, the weight of the moment hit her. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore, she was speaking for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person whose voice had been silenced, every person who had been made to feel less than human because of the color of their skin. When she began to speak, the words flowed effortlessly, a mix of passion and resolve. She recounted the events of that fateful day at the airport, how she had been treated like a criminal, how she had felt powerless and invisible. She talked about the systemic nature of racism, how it wasn't just about isolated incidents, but about a broader culture that perpetuated these injustices. As she spoke, the crowd grew silent, hanging on every word. Serena knew that her message was resonating. It wasn't just about her pain, but about the collective pain that so many others had suffered. This was a call to action, a plea for change. The rally marked a turning point in Serena's journey. It was the moment she knew she couldn't go back, that her path was forever changed. She had crossed a threshold. There was no more pretending that the system would fix itself, that things would simply get better over time. Serena understood now that real change required action, courage, and a willingness to face the hard truths. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged at an airport, she was a leader in a movement for justice, and she was committed to seeing it through. As the rally ended and the crowd dispersed, Serena stood on the stage, looking out at the people who had gathered to support the cause. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her journey was just beginning. There was still so much to do, so many battles left to fight. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful that change was not just possible, but inevitable. Because with each person who stood with her, each voice that joined the chorus, the movement grew stronger. Serena wasn't just telling a story anymore. She was making history.